I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to CIRCA. I've known Dr. Knight for a long time. We have a lot of intersections. She graduated from UNC Charlotte, and I work there now. She was at the university. She worked at the University of Kentucky, and I graduated from there. And I've been fortunate to have my paths intertwined with hers many times. And so, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, from my experience. Well, a lot of my recent work has been contextualized in some difficulties in the field, right? So my heart has been around serving kids with complex needs. I've done that since I was a peer tutor uh, many years ago, but I've actually done it professionally for over 30 now, which even though I'm sure I look like I'm in my 20s, that's not true. I'm getting up there in age. But right now, I'm worried, right, in terms of practice. So most of my work is contextualized in schools. Now, I spend a lot of time consulting in schools. I train teachers. I've started two BCBA programs. Both those are really school focused. But I also do a little bit of clinical work. I sit on some human rights boards where I review behavior intervention plans for folks with complex needs receiving services out in the community. And overall, we're in this time where I feel like we are slipping a little bit, losing some ground in terms of services. And so I'm speaking from that context. I know that things may not be exactly the same in Canada, but I do think that the things that we're going to talk about today will resonate and give you some tools maybe to help folks as you in their practice get better. So as I said before, it.
Dr. Pennington, we're seeing your
Yeah.
presenter
Oh,
slideshow.
well, let's don't do that. Let's see. I've never had this happen.
Zoom just updated and it threw me, so we'll give you a moment.
Thank you, friends. How about that now?
It's
Still the same?
It's still the
Yeah, it's
presenter
still
view.
presenter view.
Okay.
We may just have to deal with it.
There should be a thing at the top of the screen that says something about flip the screens you're viewing or something like that.
I'm going to stop share very quickly. I appreciate you, friends.
That should be it. We don't see anything yet.
What? How's this? A single slide?
With nothing on it. It's dark.
My apologies.
No worries. We maybe should have done a test run. So that's, I'll take the credit for that. There we go.
No.
Oh, too big.
No. Almost there.
You almost had it. There we go. I think.
That looks right to me.
Okay. Perfect.
All right. Perfect. Nice. So the big idea again is it's kind of rough out there for a lot of our teachers. And what I mean by that is many of us are tired. So we're seeing people out in the field with increased job demands and without adequate compensation, especially in education. I mean, you've got people that are coming in working 70 hours a week on $30,000 starting. And so it's very tough in the United States to be able to live on that and to be able to kind of rationalize staying in that field for that amount of compensation. We also see a lot of people that are really difficulty with challenging behavior. So we're seeing students that are kids that are walking out of their teacher prep programs, for instance, or out of their behavior analyst certification programs, where they've worked with young kids with autism, and suddenly they're working with 18-year-olds that are, knocking them unconscious, and they don't want to come back, right? And so it's extremely difficult that we're seeing individuals having challenges with their colleagues, I've been privy to lots of conversations with folks working in different BCBA companies. They're not happy with the environments there. And then our folks in schools are having difficulty, with their administrators, not feeling supported, not feeling like people understand what they're doing. And I think overall, this is kind of testing our faith in the field. So we look at our educators, right? So in the US, we know that over the last 10 years, things are looking sad for us. So we're seeing a huge decrease in the number of teachers that are out there serving kids with complex needs. And this is what's terrifying to me. In the last decade, there was about a 40% decrease in the number of people going into teacher prep programs in the United States. So what that means is, these classrooms are being supervised or are being managed by folks that are usually not prepared. I was in a large district yesterday meeting with folks. They have 210 self-contained programs for kids with severe disabilities. They have 40 first-year teachers that are just starting now, many of them alternative, so they didn't go through a preparation program. They still have 20 openings that they're just putting subs in, rotating. So we're almost at this place where it's reached that level of, unethical, right? We have kids that should be receiving instruction and they're just not. And then we're seeing, COVID has shook a lot of people up. And so I'm not sure about the numbers related to BCBAs in the field, but in terms of special education teachers, we saw a lot of people leave during that time. We look at our behavior analytic providers, right? We're seeing consistently them reporting moderate to high levels of exhaustion. This was a recent study, indicated that there was about 50% reported low level of a sense of personal accomplishment. Like they didn't feel like they were making a difference, which is terrifying, right? When we think about, behavior analysts, we're like, yes, we can change the world. And they're feeling like they're not, and as a result, I think this is probably why we've been one of the factors that contribute to our slow to be able to meet some of those national needs. So I know I just got heavy there for a minute. So I just want to take a second to just kind of celebrate all of you folks. I wish I could see all your faces. I just see the ones that are on the screen now, but I understand it's a mix of BCBA, some educational professionals, people in other different roles, interventionist roles. I just want to take a second to just, before we get into this heavy stuff, is to realize that I do understand that, right? So today's talk is going to be focused on you as a practitioner and you as an interventionist supporting practitioners. And the hope today is give you some strategies to kind of lift you up. So I want to take a second to celebrate, that whatever you're doing right now, I could say that you're probably making a difference, right? Or at least you're working to make a difference in the lives of young people and their families. I think that you've got a broad load, no matter whether you're in a clinical setting, school setting, center-based program, you have broad shoulders because you're carrying a crap load of responsibilities, right? You're doing your intervention, you're supervising other folks, you're interacting with parents, you've got paperwork, and that's a lot for us to manage. And because of that, it demonstrates you're smart, right? Your intellectual capacity and your broad skill repertoires to do all that. So you should just take a second again and just give yourself a little pat on the back. I know that you're in that place supporting your colleagues, right? And so I think that's huge, a lot of work. There's something about work climate that Elizabeth Bettini addresses that talks about this notion of collective responsibility, right? That when we are working together, supporting each other, we get things more done in our workplace, our work environment is better. And so in summary, I'm just going to say that before we get going, I want you to recognize yourself as kind of a badass teaching love machine, right? That's who you are. So again, thank you for being here and thank you for the work that we do. The rest of the day, we're going to get a little reflective on ourselves. So I want you to know we're going to start at that place that I respect what you do and I know how difficult it is. So here's me in 1990. This is like actually 93, 94, my first year teaching. You can tell it's the 90s, big baggy sweater and weird gold bangles and a turtleneck. I don't think I've been worn a turtleneck in 25 years. The deal is like I started teaching before I was a teacher, right? So I knew I was a teacher. My dad told me not to teach, and like any good skateboarder kid, I was like, forget you, Dad, I'm going to teach anyway. And so I just started teaching, right? And I got in my program and I was into punk rock music and social justice at the time. So I was like, so this is the right thing to do, right? But I did not know what I was doing. I barely had enough preparation to serve my kids. I loved it. Again, as I said, I identified as a teacher, even though I was not, that identification wasn't based on any particular behaviors. That's just who I decided to be, right? And I got better over time. So I was very fortunate to have some great role models around me. Early on, I started spending my own money, going to some additional trainings. I remember I saw in the late 90s, Brian Iwata come in and talk. It was like, whoa, this whole different view of objective treatment of challenging behavior just blew my mind, and from then on I was hungry and I was trying to get as many training experiences as possible. But then I was fortunate to go through a good master's program and then ultimately getting a PhD program. And I'm better now, right? I could probably go in a classroom and figure more things out than I could 25, 30 years ago. But during that time, my students had to wait. So all those kids that were high needs, that needed intensive supports, they could have got more efficient, effective instruction early on. And that's just kind of the way it is, though. When we have 40% fewer people coming in, we can't magically get somebody a repertoire pill, and ta-da, I know how to teach. That is one of the challenges. I don't know if it's a travesty, but the kind of one of the most difficult realizations that we have in intervention and working. And I would say that's even the case within our BCBAs coming out. They're still trying to figure it out, right? And so they could do better early on. And the kids that are in their care are often not getting the intensity or the quality of services that they need. So is that fair? It's not fair, right? And when we look at some of the school data, again, which is is my wheelhouse, it doesn't look good for kids. So these kids are waiting on it. So we're looking at our kids with complex needs are sitting there passively engaged in instruction. When my colleagues and I, Ginevra Corte, a couple of years ago, we just went and observed a whole bunch of classrooms and kids were just sitting there watching, right? These are kids with intellectual disability, low communication supports, and they were just being talked at, which we know that's not how our kids learn, right? In general education classrooms, kids are supposed to have their AAC devices. They're not, we're not giving it to them. One of my colleagues, Terry Scott, pointed out, and he's done probably about 5 years ago, been 13, 14,000. So probably he's near 20,000 now observations of classrooms. And they're seeing that kids that of color are getting more negative feedback than their white counterparts. So even at an early age, we're punishing kids in school context that are non-white. And then over the last half a decade, several esteemed researchers, including my friend Vicki Knight, have done some amazing lit reviews. And they're showing that, teachers are lit review survey research, but they're showing that people are not using evidence-based practices. In some cases, they're using practices that are harmful or contraindicated for kids. And so we're seeing this play out in the classroom, this lack of preparation, this lack of support. But I'm not surprised, right? So we're often insufficiently prepared to do a serious job. So if you look at preparation programs of all sorts, right, there's a broad curriculum. There's a lot of things that you have to know. And in some cases, as a behavior analyst, as somebody that lives and breathes it, and special education programs, often that behavior analysis part is about this much, right? As us as behavior analysts, it's usually pretty broad, but it's all focused within behavior analysis. But that's problematic, right? It doesn't give us the depth to really understand the conceptual underpinnings, to be flexible in our practice. You may have had this in your own experience, but you get one data point per project or assignment, right? So you go in my classes, they'll do a behavior change project. So they work all semester collecting their data, they do a functional assessment, and that's it. And we go, yay, you get an A or a B on your paper, and then they graduate. Well, all my behavior analyst friends, how many data points does a pattern make? 3, right? So most of our folks go through our programs doing their one project with one data point. And as a result, we're not even sure they've met acquisition of their target skills, and we send them out. And I would say this is the same with my BCBA courses. They usually have a practice that they have to conduct. They do it. They do a BB map. They do an assessment. They develop teaching programs, and then they move on to their next course. So we're hoping there's enough repetition of these programs for kids to get it, but oftentimes there's not. Well, I mean kids, I mean younger professionals, but sorry. We think about our supervision is varied. So in schools, it's usually retired folks that are doing supervision or overworked faculty trying to get out there to do it. And so in at least half the universities that I've been involved in, it's been folks that are probably not the most current in evidence-based practices. They're folks that are just trying to keep those first-year teachers in the classroom. or for breaking down. They're like, you can do this. And so that's helpful, and we want them to stay, but we also need people to tighten up their fidelity to continue to support them into those inductive years. Same things for our BCBAs, though. We know that supervision is diverse. I've experienced young folks that have come to me that have had supervisors that are giving no feedback, or just minimal feedback, or they're very specific to their area. So there's some great folks out there, and then there's some diverse in terms of quality. This is really interesting. A couple of colleagues, well, I don't know if it's interesting, but it is to me. But a couple of my colleagues of mine have done a series of papers. We were looking at teacher preparation programs in the area of complex communication needs. And consistently, so we've talked to students, we've talked to faculties, we've talked to kind of leaders in the field across these papers, and consistently they all feel pretty not good about what their teachers are able to do in terms of supporting kids with complex communication needs, which is problematic again, because that's probably the most important area that we need to focus on. Oh, there's a missing R. Darn, I changed my slide. So anyway, no surprise, should be surprise. But there's a really interesting paper, Eric Dubuque. I used to work at the University of Louisville, and Ellie Kazemi. Fantastic. I'm sure many of you, my BCBA friends, have seen her supervision talks. But they did a really interesting paper where they look at BCBA pass rates. And what was really interesting is, obviously, and we know it's a difficult exam, but still 2/3 of graduates don't pass the BCBA exam. But what's really interesting is the 9 out of the 223 programs are responsible for half the field's test takers. And guess what? Those programs have pretty low pass rates. So what's that saying is that some of our programs that are graduating over 100 students a year, their pass rate sometimes are in the 50s. So what's that saying is that our field is it brings to mind some questions about the competency and the preparation of folks, some of our BCBA colleagues. And finally, once folks get in the field, right, there's often insufficient support and resources. PD doesn't always address our needs. So, there's a PD opportunity, I'm gonna get some CEUs. Or if I'm a teacher, somebody comes out to our school and says, here's this thing that you have to do. In the US, it's often focused on compliance, which is important to keep people out of jail or to keep them out of due process, but it's not really always what the teachers need at that time. And then and then there's coaching. And again, there's a vast literature on coaching, but what's really interesting is coaching often comes in because somebody's not doing well, right? So you identify an area of weakness that a person has and you coach on that. So that in itself pairs coaching with this aversive circumstance. So already in some cases, people are resistant to coaching. And I like to share these slides. They're old for me, but we've all experienced this. And speaking to a large group of BCBAs, I want to remind you not to be these people. But there's coaches and consultants, right? There's the hope dopes that come in. They sit down with us and tell us what we should do, give us that list. That was probably my first year in a consultation role. I was really good at identifying problems. And I give people lists and be like, this is what you need to do. And I come back and they didn't do it. And I was so mad at them, right? The bitch and ditch, these are the consultant that comes in and they talk about how terrible everything is and then they leave. So they get everybody riled up, but they don't. If you're worth your salt as a behavior analyst, if you've done any sort of real assessment, then it's within your ethical responsibility to go forth and do something about it, right? At least that's my opinion. The nerd's not heard. And I want you to notice this is me in a picture, and this poor woman is trying to walk away from me as I'm trying to tell her about my data, right? She's like, leave. And so the idea here is, this is when the person that comes in and works with teachers or talks to us about constructs to which we're not familiar, uses, is more about trying to sound erudite and I know all these things that you don't, versus let's sit down to brass tacks and let's just talk about what we need to do here, right? And then finally is the part-time lovers. And this is for those folks that are behavior analysts, right? That they come in, they do some consultation, it's not working, and they blame the person they're working with. So that teacher's so lazy. Would you ever say that about a child with autism or severe disability? That kid is so lazy, he's just choosing not to learn. No, you wouldn't. So the idea here is we become behavior analysts when we work with our clients, with students, but when we switch to parents, coworkers, teachers, we forget that skill set. We forget that they're only responding to their environment. That "rat is always right" phrase also applies to teachers, parents, administrators. We're only doing what works for us in that time. The other thing that's really important to come out, let's go back to coaching, is coaching doesn't always work. And that's where this kind of leading us into our discussion today. So here's an example of some single case studies of the last decade. We're doing a review right now of coaching studies in early childhood. And we're seeing some of the same patterns. But what you notice is this is coaching with a researcher with support, right? Where these people are supposed to know what they're doing. They're taking fidelity. There's IOA. There's all these controls in place. Look what happens consistently across these participants. We look on the left, right? We see low levels of a target behavior. We come in and provide some sort of coaching mechanism that usually has performance feedback, some sort of different versions, whether we're giving it to them in real time or after this session. But anyway, we're there giving them consistent feedback. We get a bump, right? If you see across all these different conditions, yeah, we make some progress. But what happens during maintenance phase? When those supports aren't there, over half our participants are going back down towards baseline. So what does that tell us? That tells us that kind of rule-based intervention where I come in, tell you what to do, even if I'm there for a while, that's probably not sufficient, because what controls our behavior? This is the weird part about online. I throw it out there. What controls our behavior? I'm going to answer my own question. It's the environment. And so we're only a part of that environment. And what happens for us is, I'm going to show you this next slide here, is basically set up a withdrawal design. We go in, we put all these supports in place, we pull those out, and in a good withdrawal design, what happens, right? If we have control, we pull them away, it goes back to baseline. So the idea here is that we have to look more closely at structures within the classroom environment, within our clinical environment, to change behaviors. It can't just be rule focused. We can't just come and say, this is what you need to do and hope you do it. And I would argue that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to get there in a minute. Sorry, overuse of animations. So let's go back and start thinking about, what if we applied our science of human behavior? We weren't part-time lovers, and we started looking at our practice as a collection of behaviors, just like we do our students or the clients that we work with. We behave, we plan, we assess, we teach, we provide feedback. These are all behaviors, right? These are things, when we do them well, and we have lots of these, they're our repertoire. They're our interventionist repertoire, our teaching repertoire. And that repertoire stays with us based on our experiences, right? So if we've learned them, we've had lots of success across multiple contexts with those, we're more likely to generalize them and maintain those. But just knowing something doesn't mean that it's something that we apply often within our practice. So in the past, we're hopefully many of us are really good at this idea of a functional assessment, right? So we look at a student's target behavior. We say, okay, there's antecedents. Are we rewarding them? Are we punishing them? We understand our consequences. But I think it's more important for us to start looking like this. So we start putting ourselves and the people we work with in the center. So at the beginning, maybe the child is a part of that antecedent condition. We respond because that's the behavior we're interested in, right? And then we start looking at, what do we get out of that, right? And we've got some simple principles that we have to remember when we're looking at this with teachers. So even though teachers engage in behaviors that increase improvement in their circumstances, I keep looking at this slide that's covered with this, and I have to switch back to here. They realize that they're not always aware, right? So they may engage in behaviors that change their environment quickly, and as a result, their life is better because of it, but they're not thinking about that. The teacher that yells at a child and says, "Stop it," they know they didn't want to be that naggy person, but that child stops for a minute. Now, they may have reinforced that behavior, whatever, but the problem is the teacher yelling at the child. And so in the moment, they're not making a decision, right? They're not sitting there going like, well, I think I'm going to yell at this kid. It just happens because it works for them. Some of you guys that are parents that on those days, that's not you weren't your best self. Again, you didn't choose that to do that. It just happened. And so there's a little bit of forgiveness we have to apply there, and we also have to think a little bit about how we would change that repertoire by manipulating environmental circumstances. Have to understand that that change and improvement in circumstances is different for different people. Just like you're doing a preference assessment for a little kid with autism, some kids like gummy bears, some kids like chips, some kids like the iPads. Some adults are very different. Some respond differently to consultant feedback. Some care more about having a little bit more free time in their day. Some are reinforced by plowing through like the series of activities and getting them done. So any disruption of their day can affect their behavior. So really understanding the differences and preferences that people have in their classroom or in their programs are very important. I do think I have somebody that needs to mute a little bit because we're getting a little chatter. So let's talk for a second, just quickly, and remind you about all these interventionist behaviors that are out there. So providing opportunities to respond. So if you're at a clinic, we're talking about trials or students, probably in the classroom, asking the question, having them respond, feedback, use of prompts, staff interactions, application of procedures. There's a billion of these things, right, that we can focus and can be the target of our intervention. So if we look at the target of the intervention, the teacher implementing these practices, we start applying that three-term contingency to them. There's environmental antecedents, the things up front are things like, well, the bell rings in their classroom. Is that strong enough? Does that have enough stimulus control for the teacher to start teaching? In my world, I go into classrooms and the bell rings in the morning and the teacher takes like 40 minutes. Kids are all over the place before they even start teaching, and we're missing 40 minutes of instruction time. You may see that in the clinic, like, oh, they just arrived. You know, it takes a while to get things going. But again, we're missing opportunities for kids to respond and time and intervention. Maybe the student hand raise should evoke a particular response, or a paraprofessional lack of performance. I see it a lot where somebody's not doing a good job, so somebody else just pops in and does it for them, and that becomes the pattern, right? Versus reteaching the skill that needs to get there. Our student problem behavior, as I mentioned before, when people aren't prepared to work with unique, challenging behaviors, they can evoke a whole range of responses in an adult. Let's talk. This is the most interesting part. Let's talk about reinforcers. So, let's say any given evidence-based practice or an effective practice, what is the reinforcer for doing that? Anybody want to share? I'm going to give me a sec. I'm going to readjust my screen so I can get the chat going. All right, friends. Tell me, somebody in the room, what would be a reinforcer for what does a teacher get out of it, a behavior analyst get out of it that will maintain that practice just over time? We can sit awkwardly until somebody just types anything. I thought Canadians were cooler than people in the United States. There you go. Feeling that it was just a little delayed reaction. You guys were thinking about it. You're very deliberate. Yes, good job. Yeah, more time to teach versus manage behavior. Sure, feels like seeing kids make progress. So let's talk about some of these things. That's the comment. If I talk to a room of teachers and I say, "Why are you doing this?" And they're like, "For the kids." So let's talk about those quickly. So one, is it compensation? Maybe, right? I would say compensation doesn't necessarily hinge on very particular behaviors. If you're in the classroom, you can do a pretty mediocre job and still get paid. Some behavior analytic companies are the same way. As long as you're kind of within these parameters, you still get your paycheck. So I'd say it doesn't select particular behaviors. Student progress, that's the big one, right? That's what Jennifer brought up. And I would agree. I mean, gosh, there's nothing more reinforcing than teaching a kid his first words or challenging behavior so a child is able to access their community more freely. But if that was the only reinforcer, and would we ever use ineffective practices for long periods of time? No, right? Because we'd essentially be put on extinction. We'd do it, it wouldn't work. We'd do it, it wouldn't work. We'd do it, it wouldn't work. And so that can't be enough. And we do see that. We see these people persisting for long periods of time, implementing the same practice without change. And so therefore, it cannot be enough. But I do think it's an important piece of the puzzle. Avoiding problem behavior, absolutely. I was in a state the other day where they have 1 billion sensory rooms. They're still building all these sensory rooms that kids are going in, and basically, it helps him avoid problem behavior, right? So the kid melts down. Well, he needs to calm down. He needs some sensory feedback. Let's put him in this room for a while, and he can hang out. And you can see that behavior is problematic because kids aren't learning. They aren't very strong about any of those types of interventions. But the teacher is rewarded because they're exhausted, and that kid is calm for a period of time. And again, obviously they're reinforcing the behavior, but you can see how that can serve as a reinforcer. Immediate cessation of problem behavior, absolutely. And feedback. Let's talk about feedback. Again, as I mentioned, you saw the examples there where even during intervention sessions, when the coach was giving feedback, we started seeing a decline for a lot of the participants. Consultant feedback, BCBA feedback, sometimes it's helpful, right? Sometimes they care about what you say, but usually only for a while, right? There's a contingency with you providing support, like, I don't want to let this person down, or there's some sort of judgy factor. That's why they stop caring. Honestly, I think you're great for a while, but then okay, when are you leaving my classroom? And really, Florence T. Gennaro and Reed in 2007, 2009 I believe those are the right dates, but this really beautiful study where basically she set contingencies, whereas if you did a good job, we're going to terminate our coaching sessions. And guess what? Teachers were psyched because they're like, yes, I want you out of my classroom. But that's a really powerful moment for me to realize that we have to think about realistic contingencies to support teacher behavior. What about parents? Sure, parents, we care about what parents think. What about our administrators? I think there's a level, right, of how well you value your administrator's opinion, right? If you come in an administrator that hasn't been in the field very long, or isn't a special ed person, or maybe they're just kind of like a business manager in your BCBA clinic, and they come and say, I think your prompting's not so great. What are you going to say? You're going to be like, you don't even know what you're talking about, right? But let me ask all of you this, and listen to this carefully. What if you hear, if you're a special ed teacher, you hear that the other teachers in the building think you're not good at teaching kids? Or if you're in a clinic, what if you hear the other behavior analysts or RBTs think you're not a good clinician? All of you right now should feel that little bit like, oh, yeah, that's horrible. That's heartbreaking. And I would argue that, and this leads into what we're going to talk about even further today, is that I think it's a really important contingency, is getting people together. So think about the environment, right? Think about things like we send the student out of the room. What do they get? Again, they get a break. They get some sort of reinforcement. Termination's gone, right? We move on to the next directive about providing feedback for an error response. Well, the kid makes an error. There's our antecedents. So we have to, maybe we can train somebody to detect those a little bit better. But what do they get when they do it? Well, they keep going forward, right? So I know that when there's a pause, the kid engages in problem behavior. And so I just want to keep going fast and forget the error correction response. So we have to address that issue in making a difference and fixing that error in the teacher. So maybe, again, just another example of kind of breaking this down more beyond behavior modification, but really looking at the environment here. Maybe we have a problem where a child interrupts a lecture and the teacher needs to send them to the office. Well, what the teacher gets, again, is a future potential interruptions are removed. Well, maybe instead we could say, office, don't accept this kid anymore. Useful extinction. Or you can accept the kid, but they have to lose a classroom assistant to come down with it. So there's a consequence. It's like, that maybe keeps them in the classroom. Maybe we train the teacher to something else to do, an alternative response. So we teach how to use the good behavior game, and there's a consequence she can deliver that way instead of sending the student to the office. So again, we're teaching them alternative response. Teacher can provide some alternative reminder. Maybe we can change instructional format. Maybe our issue is that a child admits appropriate response, and we don't have the teachers delivering praise at high enough rates. That's a national problem, at least in the US. There are volumes of data showing that we just cannot give kids enough praise. And I think it's because it's weird, right? How weird is it if somebody comes up to you and they're like, I really like the way that you did this. You think that person's shifty. In our real lives, when was the last time you you told your partner that they were doing such a great job vacuuming the living room or taking the trash out. No, we take people for granted because it's just kind of weird, right? If that starts happening, you're like, what do you want? And so somehow as interventionists, we have to deviate from the norm, right? And increase those response rates. That's one of the reasons I think it's so hard. But again, we can do things like we can train peers to respond, right? We can enlist colleagues to provide us feedback. So if I'm having a hard time doing it, get a colleague to watch a video and give me feedback on that. This is interesting. What I mean by train peers to respond is, and this is a study that we failed, so it's theoretical, but the idea is that we could train peers to be able to respond when a teacher gives them positive feedback. So nice job, thanks, right? They get something out of it. Usually kids don't, right? They just keep moving. Maybe we can teach kids to recruit. So instead of, if we're not giving them enough attention or we're not picking up the signals to do it, we teach kids to recruit that attention. We can apply self-monitoring ourselves, all these different strategies. So the idea is we're starting to apply interventions that we would do with our kids with the adults that we work with. So let's get into it. We've kind of talked a little bit now about, the second word is geezer. Geezer. The bass player of Black Sabbath, just so you guys know. That means if you're a Black Sabbath fan, there's only two other options but you won't know which one is for the final word. All right. So we're going to talk quickly about moving the needle. And I apologize. I've rambled a little bit. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit to make sure we get through this. So maybe a couple of years ago, based on some of the work we were doing across our state, we started conceptualizing the work that we do with teachers and other professionals as kind of writing an IEP for them. And what that means is, at first it's like, oh, the teachers may not take that well. But the idea is that you can't target everything, right? People are coming into their field missing a lot of skills. And so then what we could do instead is we could prioritize for them certain skills, right? Have them meet those skills and then keep going, right? So the idea is that instead of cover it all at once, let's really focus, let's prioritize, let's put all engines in supporting the skill development and then move forward from there. So we kind of worked through this plan over the last couple of years. One is kind of reframing our teaching practice, engaging in some sort of assessment, selecting measurable and achievable goals on teacher behavior, which is the hardest thing to do. I do this all across the country. We spend whole days with teachers doing this assessment we're showing a little bit, and we have them write goals. And teachers writing goals for themselves is tough. They're so used to writing what we call professional growth plans, or these kind of weird nebulous goals about, I'm going to do better in terms of my professional growth. And it's really hard for them to pinpoint behaviors for themselves. We're going to ask you to build partnerships. You can't do it alone, especially when we don't have the supports. Our teachers in rural communities, our teachers that are feeling isolated, our clinicians that are, I work with folks in Montana and other states where there's just a few behavior analysts, right? And then we're going to say to make that change, you've got to change the environment and then monitor progress. So let's kind of get going. First, the idea is there are no bad educators, right? So that idea, that construct that we have, why is a teacher bad or why is a clinician bad? Because they do bad things. Why do they do bad things? Because they bad, right? That's the old Captain Caveman, if you're of my age, ilk. But, it's the same thing. We don't do this with kids, right? We don't say there's a bad kid. We try to pull away from those constructs. But I'm telling you, I still hear constantly this notion of teachers are lazy. They just don't want to do it. They're just ready to retirement ready. Clinicians, we got to get that guy out. I didn't know what he's doing. And that's not a helpful practice. People are in the field. We've got them in there. We should put fire on all cylinders to try to get them to stay in the field and give them the skills that they need. Nobody ever said, I want to be a mediocre interventionist, ever, right? Nobody ever got into this field and said, you know what? I'm going to go in there and just screw up kids, right? I'm just going to half-ass it all the way. That's not the way it rolls, right? I teach undergraduates, and undergraduates are like, and I ask them this question, who's going to be a great teacher? And they're like, and they're all so cute and excited about it. I'm like, that's great, but that's not true. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, about 10, 15% are going to be awesome. A lot of you are going to be mediocre, and some of you are not going to be very good. And then we talk about it, right? And and try to help them bolster against ways or bolster against practices that might creep into their lives to shape them downward into less effective teachers. So again, no bad educators, probably just people in need of some support and some opportunities to grow. And instead of saying change should be like this, which I think is inevitable, you're going to have this big leap because preparation programs are so different from the real life. Even if you're a BCBA, you did supervision in one setting, you get a job somewhere else, they're so different that there's always this level. But the most effective way is if we look at where a person is and we start moving them forward a little bit at a time. At least that's in my experience or my opinion. This next part of this, in terms of reframing teachers, and I like to share this, so we help people get out of their heads, right? And I'm trying to speak to both. I keep using the word teacher because I spend a lot of time in education, but I hope that my clinical friends and my community providers understand where I'm coming from. So again, the idea is that we all get these thoughts, right? We're all going to have pressure. If I have a room full of folks, and I do this all the time, I'm like, who's thought about doing something different in the last couple of years? You get like 85% of people raising their hand, right? These probably ask the same thing of people in academia. You get the same hand raised. But the idea is that everybody feels defeated at times, right? And we have these narratives in our head. And so I have found a lot of help in doing this by kind of starting to engage and act and just some of the simple practices there, some simple acceptance commitment therapy practices. But I'm just going to tell you this. Remind people that when they have these narratives, right, in their head, like, I can't do this or this, it pulls them away from the things that they need to be doing now. And so again, I'm not saying that we're going to shortcut a whole ACT process, but I think it's okay to help remind people that you're thinking too much about it. Let's just look right now, do an assessment of my environment and figure out what I can do to improve my practice right now. And again, just an example, we could do all these different things. Instead, we spend a lot of time thinking about it. If you haven't read it, I share this with people all the time, The Happiness Trap. Russell Harris, it's just a really dumbed down ACT version, but it gives teachers and even professionals some very simple strategies to kind of get out of their heads and start doing some stuff. And I think it's just a really nice read and a great resource. So again, the reason you're like, why is he sharing this information? It's because for some reason, lots of practitioners find me an okay person to cry to. And so I have talked a lot of people through staying in or even transitioning. And so I just know how difficult the field can be and how people feel broken sometimes when they're having a bad year. Thank you, Pratinda. So she posted a resource there on PsychWire, Happiness Trap. There's a course. So the idea, again, is when we're working with folks, we approach it from not everybody can do everything. Our good old Skinner quote, we're just doing the best we can given our circumstances and our learning history. We just have to convince people to keep working, right? And so the next part of this process is we start engaging in some assessment, right? And so we could certainly, if we wanted to, and I don't, the literature is not very deep on this part, but we could go in and we could do some functional assessment of teacher behavior, right? We could come in and do some recording. I've actually had some workshops where I've had people try to do that, and it's really hard. So imagine there's a teacher in a classroom with a child. You always look at the child in the center, and it's very hard to shift that teacher and their behavior into the middle of that contingency when you're recording. The other way to do this, I think, is that we can also start looking at program assessment. That's what we're going to focus on today a little bit. Again, the idea is that if we don't tell somebody where they are within their repertoire and their practice or help them find that, then they don't know where to go and they can't take those small steps in context success. And then we're going to lose them, right? So I'm going to share with you the Alcott today. So the Alcott is the Autism and Low Incidence Classroom Observation Tool. Again, it's not, there are other ones out there. So this is not, I'm not hawking this. If you look back at that IEP for me, 2017 paper, 2016 paper, there's a figure in there that has the old previous version. So again, the idea, if you just want to use some of it and you like it, that's in there. But when I was working in Kentucky, I directed our autism training center, and a part of that work involved going into classrooms, developing model classrooms that were serving kids with autism and more severe disabilities. Then that work expanded, serving kids with autism with more severe disabilities and more self-contained classrooms, but also kids with autism in a range of settings, or autistic individuals in a range of settings. We went through, and we were a part of the original National Professional Development Center's coaching crew, and they were using a tool called the APERS that we found was really long, had like 30 something pages. It was all Likert scale, and I wanted dichotomous, yes, no, one pager. And so we constructed this. So far, just how we've used it is we've used it in coaching teachers. We've used it district-wide. We use it in the U.S. We have these statewide professional development grants where the federal department gives the states money to be able to improve teacher practice. We use it in our teacher preparation programs. So our teachers start their classrooms, and we're doing induction with people that are alternative certification. We go in and measure their progress on this tool. So that's kind of the use. It's got 37 items. Scored as evidence, partial evidence, or not evidence. We had to add the partial evidence because people scored so poorly on the evidence that they just were discouraged. They would see it, they only have 5, and then they would just feel real bummed out. So we found a way to find them, to give them credit for some things that they were doing. Basically, we use it as should be able to observe this within an hour and ask some questions. So an hour observation, you should be able to see everything on this with the addition of answering a few questions. Most often we use it now as a self-evaluation tool. So we have a teacher, a team, or a clinic team, or a private school team go in and score themselves around that and come to consensus. And then we might do a validation observation and work with them to identify targets. There's kind of 6 areas in this: environmental supports, instructional supports, instruction, communication instruction, behavior supports, and staff interactions. And I'm going to just kind of go through these quickly. Again, I've blabbered on. I could probably have you for 3 hours today, but I want to make sure that we kind of get through this. So the environmental supports, these are the items here. Basically, can staff observe all areas of the classroom, with the visual supports and tactile cues. We're also addressing kids with visual impairments and sensory impairments, schedules, signals clearly indicate when transitions are approaching, students are in close proximity with their peers, AT. We have in the assessment tool operationalized definitions of what these mean at each level. But the idea is what we generally see is that the general issue is the student safe? Where are they? Are there supports around for them? And then what we usually see is unpredictable routines. Kids are jerked all over the place. Like, you're teaching one group of kids and you look at the clock. And so we have difficult transition because we haven't prepared kids for it. Problems with classroom arrangement. We were in a classroom last week where, not last week, excuse me, a few months ago, where an individual, they had like a ball pit in the middle of the classroom and kids were engaged in dangerous behavior. And we're like, why don't we just move the ball pit? And that's one of those easy fixes. But we see that a lot. Instructional supports area is really those things that you kind of need to guide instruction. So there's lesson plan, systematic instruction plans, which to my sadness is not common in the United States. I was at the University of Kentucky where that's kind of what you did, and as behavior analysts, we call these program plans, where you've got your little antecedent, your description, your prompting procedures, but those aren't available in a lot of classrooms. So we expect a high quality program to have that. Staff are engaged in instructional activities when not on a break. Data are collected on multiple student objectives. We've got some, we expect people to plot data on line graphs, and that the individuals are able to explain when they should stop instruction or modify their instruction. So they've got some decision-making rules. So you can see this area is kind of all around making sure the supports are in place to provide good instruction. So the idea is, are there mechanisms to promote fidelity and evaluate the student progress? The biggest issue is we see no planning, right? So people are just kind of by the seat of their pants implementing plans. And then we also see that people don't graph. They wait until their goals are due, and then they plot their data, and they can't tell you their decision-making rules, which is horrifying. And I would say this isn't just schools. Again, I review a lot of behavior plans, and what I'm seeing now is these giant behavior plans that are copy-pasted, where they have 10,000 procedures on them to make sure everything is covered. And I just, as a outsider who reviews these plans, sometimes I wonder, like, how can these ever be implemented by anyone, right? And so Again, poor kind of planning under the hood prior to instruction. The next part is instruction. So you're looking at things like no student sits for more than 5 minutes without instruction. We're seeking attention responses before delivering instruction. We generally deliver the same directive only once and then use response prompting or feedback to ensure the student's response is correct. We're delivering consistent feedback, age-appropriate materials, preference assessments. We're seeing instruction in at least 2 other skill domains besides academic. And so because this is focused in schools, academic instruction is required, but we're also seeing that kids are being taught to request during those times. They're working on self-management skills. There's social interactions occurring there. So within an hour, we should be able to see all those things, at least instruction on 2 or 3 of those domains. Staff are teaching academic skills that are aligned with the general education curriculum, and they're using methods to promote generalization, which again, for us as behavior analysts, that should be common. You should know how to program for that, but there's still a lot of my teacher friends that wasn't in their preparation programming. Or it's thought of as this thing. I actually just recently got a review on a paper where we talked about generalization strategies. And the comment that we had, and this is from a researcher, was that, oh, you shouldn't focus on generalization until you focus on acquisition. And that's not true. Generalization occurs usually after we acquire something, but during when we're teaching skills, we program common stimuli, we use multiple exemplar instruction, all those types of things. And so those things should be important in terms of good program. And our combinations are a lot of downtime. I was in North Carolina, so there's still a lot of teach programs, which is great. There's a lot of good teach stuff, but I always like to say to folks, how many times do kids have to practice matching, to get it? We still have classrooms filled with laminated file folders where kids are doing the same activities over and over again. So there's large periods of time when kids are not acquiring new skills. You're going to go into settings where there's a few adults and a lot of kids. And so some of those things have to happen, but they should not take up a large proportion of the day. It's basically, I don't think it's defensible. I mean, really, when you have kids that are never going to catch up in many of the skills, right? And so we have to be programming thoughtful, a thoughtful and intensive curriculum for them to sit doing these same tasks over and over and over and over again. And I know a lot of times we think about, oh, these might be job preparation skills, but their jobs don't look like this hardly at all anymore, right? It reminds me of we want to make sure that, I'll say this, we want to make sure that we're not preparing kids to go into sheltered workshops, which are still a thing, right? So communication instruction, simple. Imagine when I did this, I was a young PhD graduate and a behavior analyst. And so I wanted to have a list that had 7,000 items on it. But the idea was we couldn't. We had to go broad. We had to go focused for the staff, the folks that we were working with. So students' IEPs had they were addressing social communication objectives. They all have a functional communication system defined by using a conventional form that other people can understand. They have their supports at all time, right? We always talk about that if you don't, that's a version of restraint. We teach and facilitate peer interactions, and that all students have opportunities to engage in activities with peers without disabilities. And so again, this is really around this community of competency of priority. And our biggest issues are there's no communication instruction, or it's only provided by a speech pathologist twice a day for 30 minutes. It's not systematic, poor plan of the AAC system. So even though aided language modeling is awesome, people have, kind of launched into hook, line, and sinker these large core boards with 1 million pictures on it for kids that are just beginning to communicate. And it just doesn't make sense to me in terms of what we know about learning and discrimination. And they're not a bad practice, just it's not something for every kid. So there's a lot of things that we see when we're out in the schools. Behavior management stuff, again, staff provides students multiple opportunities to make choices. We refrain from negative feedback. We avoid the use of restraint and seclusion, and we do have some procedures if they're a very specified behavior plan and for a short period of time, so it's dangerous. BIPs are written for persistent challenging behavior, and staff-student interactions promote dignity. So things like we're not talking about kids when we're there, those types of things. So I know this a lot. I just want to kind of show you how we're going through. So the idea is really an environment generally reinforcing. And is there kind of a function-based approach to addressing challenging behavior? And our biggest issues is there's not assessment. People are just throwing things at kids without understanding function-based treatments, and a lot of reactive strategies still. And then finally, this is probably the mushiest, right? So this is like, do we all get along? Yes, Pretender, that is a beautiful article. So yeah, Carnett and colleagues did a really great paper on on aided language, not aided language modeling, on core vocabulary, core language. Super cool. So thanks for sharing that and check it out. Our staff communicate weekly with related service staff. Do we establish methods for communications with families? Do people have plans? Our RBTs, our paraprofessionals have plans prior to assisting with instruction? And again, do we get along? Are we responsive to each other? A couple of years ago, we did a great, I don't know if it was great, but I did a 6-hour training on working with paraprofessionals that's available here with the at the TSLAT group down in Texas. So you're welcome to access that. So after we do that, we ask folks to think for a minute, kind of where are you? And I'm gonna do this little exercise with you quickly because we still have some time. So I want for you, we're gonna do it shortly, but I want for you to answer this for yourself. So if you're in a school setting, I want you to think about the kids that you work with. If you're in a clinic or a specialized program, I want you to think about all the kids that you work with in that program, right? So first, can all students use conventional communication skills to control their access to preferred and non-preferred conditions? So that's number one. And I promise you that in my experience, there is the majority of classroom teachers in the US could not answer this yes. And our folks that work this area, it's not super difficult to just get a manding repertoire. I mean, and especially even for our kids with the most complex needs, we can get, I've taught kids that just have simple sounds, or eye movement to be able to make requests. Okay, number two, are all students and teaching staff engaged in meaningful instruction or intervention throughout the day? I know that seems really hard, but the fact is that I keep saying the fact is, but our profession is serious. Our job is to change lives and improve outcomes for individuals, and so we have to be going hard all day to make sure kids have the support they need. Can't mean we can't have fun, right? It doesn't mean we don't love what we do, but we can't have large periods of time where every break that we get is an opportunity for kids to miss opportunities of learning. Do we collect and graph data and use this data to make instructional decisions? I would hope that my folks working in clinical settings, that would be a yes. But maybe your question is, do we make changes quickly enough in response to those data? Do we always use instructional practices, including ensuring when necessary, we obtain students' attention, present clear directives, prompt when necessary, and provide feedback? So does everyone under your care, supervision, can they all do time delay and system of least prompts and most least prompt can do it accurately? Because when we don't, we lose efficiency and sometimes efficacy in our instruction. Do we use function-based approaches to challenging behavior? And is my team functional and efficient? So those are questions. And so usually what we do when we're using the Alcott or something is we'll have the team come around, complete the entire Alcott, and then have them sit around and discuss their priority areas. And so what we do is when we talk about those priority areas, we say, look, you got to keep kids safe. Is there anything that you identified that would prevent a child from being safe, right? We might look at things that have the most impact. So are you taking data? If you're not taking data, we don't even know that you're teaching or you're intervening, right? Intervening or teaching like I'm doing now without having data on your performance afterward is just presenting. The high, yay, I did a good job presenting, but doesn't mean that I actually did a good job teaching you anything. And these might be things like communication behavior supports. I always tell folks, if kids don't have your communication systems in your classroom, that's where you should start. Because how are they showing what they know in academic instruction? How are they interacting with peers? they're probably engaging in challenging behavior. So again, you're hitting multiple areas, for instance, on the Alcott, if you can just establish some good communication skills. So maybe if you look at this item here, you can look at the Alcott, look at communication. Most of the areas are in the E, are in the not evidence, right? So maybe we're going to look at things like all students will have a functional communication system. We'll use it to make requests. That's my goal for us, for our team. And maybe they're going to increase the number of OTRs throughout the day or increase the number of interactions between peers. Those could be sub goals that I want to address. So what would it look like if those areas were improved? And what behaviors are required to get there? So I asked folks to start thinking about how they would record their own behavior. So we do this in research studies a lot, but when we're working in classrooms, we don't usually take hard data on our performance, right? On the skills that we want to increase or decrease. So it could be permanent product, right? So maybe if I'm working with a team and we're like, we have a problem that we're not collecting sufficient data. So can I go in and take probes and say, okay, let's look at the data, right? And so we look at all the students' objectives, and we score how many have data, and how many are graphed, and those data reflect current data. So that you have a graph, but if you have a graph and you haven't applied data in 3 weeks, it doesn't count, right? Maybe it's simple. I walk in the classroom, we have to remove visual barriers from the classroom. Again, one of the biggest, you have a challenge with kids that elope, but you have tall shelves where you can't see kids. That's a problem, right? Maybe it's the percent of students with visual schedules. Maybe we look at things like changes in number, the rates of positive feedback, or percent. We could do intervals of teacher feedback or percent of intervals with paraprofessionals engaged in instruction. So I can come in and probe against an empirical question whether or not we can extrapolate from small observations. But Scott and colleagues, there's a whole crew there, Nick Gage, Terry Scott, Regina Hearn. These folks have shown that if you take an 15-minute observation of student behavior during academic instruction and OTR and teacher like OTRs and feedback, that correlates with performance the rest of the day. So maybe we can look at some of these other things. We observe for an hour and then we say, okay, this gives us at least a snapshot of what typical performance might look like. So maybe you have this simple recording form like this. Every 5 minutes you score, was there positive feedback? Do they deliver prompts? Do they prompt communication? Whatever your target is, we can use interval recording. Maybe it's changes in duration, number of minutes or percent of time students or paraprofessionals are not engaged in instruction, or a change in latency, number of seconds from transition into classroom to instruction. So again, these are all things that we can count, and when we can count it, we can target and see the impact that we have on that teacher behavior or a client behavior, or our therapist behavior. And again, of course, procedural fidelity, which should be pretty good for most of us, right? So now the hard work begins, right? So we start developing some of these goals. So students will have functional communication system. No students will sit for more than 10 minutes without instruction. Staff will implement prompting changes with 90% accuracy. Staff will reduce their use of negative feedback to students. So maybe if we take this one, all students will have a functional communication system. Maybe I will first identify for each of my students with complex communication needs a primary response form around which to deliver instruction. So I start breaking into steps now. I'll increase the number of daily instructional trials am I requesting for all of my students with complex communication needs. So again, we still are plagued by this, like, let's do 5 PECS trials during snack time, when really we should be intervening all day long, right? All staff will implement high quality reading instruction supports for students. Well, maybe at first, all staff will implement the system of these prompts with at least 80% accuracy to support students answering questions in response to reading. Maybe all staff will then be able to implement scripted reading programs with 90% accuracy, right? So I have a problem with the teachers doing everything, but I've got 10 kids and only 3 adults. I've got to get everybody running small groups. Students will increase their opportunities to learn within their general education program. So maybe general education teachers will increase the rate to which they direct OTRs to students with extensive support needs. I apologize, I've been switching complex communication needs, extensive support needs. General education peers will increase the rate in which they interact with students with ESN and general education settings. So once we develop those goals, and that's hard for people to get their heads around. Again, I promise you, if you sit down with your staff, you say, let's write some goals, it will take a while for them to do that. Then we want to document it. Because again, when we document these things on an implementation plan, it's less hierarchical. It's like we did an assessment together. we agreed on these goals. Let's see how we're doing. It's not like, here's the list of things I want you to do. This is a document around which we can measure our own progress, just from a product. All right. I have a couple, I have a minute before I talk to I'm trying to decide whether I just blast through it or I pause right here for a second. Does anybody have any questions or anything that's resonating with them? I'm expecting now Canadians are deliberate, so it's going to take a minute. You guys are thoughtful. Anybody decide pretender? But of course, you're welcome to. Okay, then we'll save it towards the end. So let's talk for a few minutes about the things that we need to do to be able to move things forward. We're kind of building into a model here. Oh, no problem. So I think the first thing that we have to do in terms of improving our practice is make sure we're building partnerships. The idea of that kind of collective responsible or collectively accountable community towards moving forward. So teachers, when we pair teachers, clinicians together to work on goals, we get to capitalize on those important social contingencies, which again, I think are probably some of the most powerful things in our work. When we're at a workplace and we think of like our environment, it really is our teachers that we probably think the most about, right? I mean, that's a part of being in a place when you're surrounded by people that you love in your school, your clinic, even your institution of higher education. That is really what drives us forward. And it's those social contingencies that are powerful. So being accountable to those in public, to our colleagues, I think is extremely important. So we've also had, and this isn't new, again, and the Joyce and Showers and Showers and Joyce both in 96 published the papers talking about, if we just do some professional development and we ask teachers to watch each other. So you attend the professional development together, you watch each other, we can see progress. So this isn't, a new concept. To me, it's also really pragmatic for us that are working, there's so little time. So again, lots of folks that are in coaching positions, there's just not enough of you to get around. At one point, I was working for a large school district and I had 78 kids on my caseload. I was rendered incompetent. I was just trying to show up and be there. And each of those 78 kids had a bunch of teachers around them, their parents I was accountable to. And again, it's not something that is doable. And so again, we've got to, when there's not enough people in positions to coach, we have to support people in helping each other out, right? So, sorry, got a little mixed up there in the slides. When you're in that position, you might set up some systems for folks to be, so if you're doing professional development around a skill area, you might bring folks together. You might set up systems for data sharing on their performance. So this might be teaching them how to take a small clip on their phone of them practicing a skill and then sharing it back and forth. We're working now on some systems where so we're taking data on teacher performance, but we're using shared graphs so they have to plot their performance and make it accountable so the other person gives them feedback on that performance. So again, setting up some systems where it might include even a timeline. So saying every 2 weeks, I need you to meet with your partner and review your progress. So it's not just like, get together. It's really setting up a system to make that work. The other thing that we can do is we want to make sure is that we can, enlist high quality professional development. So again, CIRCA has some great resources for you, but there are resources all over the web now. And I'm a little bit concerned in some cases that we've really, I'm not concerned because I'm glad it's definitely an advancement in the field, but they're the new answer to lots of things. Just watch a video on it. And I'm not sure that that's going to work for everybody, right? In terms of I've made millions of videos for folks I'll get your question in just a second, Bernard. We'll get through this slide, but thank you. So in terms of, the idea is that at minimum, you should find a PD co-conspirator. So what that means is we're going to set people up and then we're going to have them chunk. So here's a module that I want you to watch. I want you to watch. So that means I have to know the module. I want you to watch this first part, talk about it, and then over time, finish the module together. At least that gives individuals an opportunity for them to have some conversation around it. If it's something that they're training, then you can actually have them download a fidelity sheet and have them practice with each other. But again, this idea is that people don't go necessarily just alone. All right. A bunch of resources that are out there. You can have access to the slides. So, and I just moved to Ocala, which I'll be starting in the spring. And if you're not familiar with the Ohio Center on Autism and Low Incidence, they have 20 centers with 1 million resources. And I think they have one of the best kind of autism introduction videos, which is pretty great. Autism Strategies in Action. So check them out, ocala.org. We're going to train. A couple other things is, again, we want to make sure that and I know that for my behavior analyst friends, BST is like a no-brainer. But we start working in schools, we suddenly get really uncomfortable asking other adults to do things for us. But you have to realize that the students that we're working with, it's that important that something's done correctly. So to not assure that somebody is performing, whether it's a new clinician, whether it's a new teacher, whether it's a paraprofessional or RPT, a family member they're working with, to not train something right kind of devalues our practice altogether. And so if we're going to make a recommendation that we are probably getting compensated to do so, and we care about the clients that we work with, we've got to make sure people are implementing things well. So that means providing a script, answering questions about that script, modeling, showing people what to do, and then having them rehearse to fidelity. And I know earlier in my career, there are many times I go, yeah, you got this, you can do it, because you don't want to ruffle feathers. But if you come from this approach of this more objective approach of, look, this is something that we've identified that we need to grow on. It's just a behavior, and oftentimes when I present, I'll start maybe make an error, like, oh, look, I didn't mean that, and show them that we're all vulnerable, but then really make sure that when we leave, before they're working with their students or clients, the people that they're serving as change agents for, we make sure they have that practice under their belt. I would say we can't even go back and gripe about them not doing it if we didn't at least engage in BST. A couple of years ago, I was really fortunate to be a guest editor for a journal called Teaching Exceptional Children, and they did a special issue on behavior analysis. And this paper by Florence DeGennaro-Reed is an amazing paper on how to support teachers, but I think it also applies to clinicians and has some really great strategies for supporting them. So I would, it's really not dense. It's written for practitioners, so it's a really great resource. Talks about things like directed rehearsal and has some really great strategies. So I would check that out. In terms of other resources for peer coaching, we want to get our peers involved. And so this is this idea of practice-based coaching. So again, the idea is that when we use practice-based coaching with peers, we can get peers involved in their shared goals, their action planning, focus observation with each other, and then reflection and feedback. And that is speaking to what I was addressing a little bit earlier. I just got my slides out of order here. And then finally, if you recall, I presented to you earlier this model of what we kind of like a withdrawal design. Like we go in, we do all this high power supports, and then we pull back out. We hope they keep doing it. The fact is that if we can, we want to leave things in their environment, right? That will help kind of mediate that maintenance of that practice. And so that's probably using some sort of self-monitoring system. So whether we leave visual supports with individuals, checklists. We were doing a study once where we were trying to get a teacher to answer questions, the dialogic reading study. We couldn't get her to do it. And so we just, on this page, we put sticky notes. Remember, this is the place to do it. Any sort of visual supports that we use in our daily lives for ourselves that we can apply to our colleagues can be effective. Self-monitoring is a great practice. And I would recommend that if you're going to go in there and you're going to change a teacher behavior or a clinician behavior, that you leave some system for them to record it over time, unless you know that you're going to be in that environment long term, right? And so that might be a half the time revibrating watch. So imagine this. Imagine you're working in your clinic, you're working in your school, and you have a bunch of students that use speech generating devices. And we know that we have a problem of getting those in close proximity to our students at all times. So we can set our timer. It vibrates every 15 minutes. I've got a data sheet. I look around at my 8 to 10 kids and go, which one has their device with it sitting in front of them within arm's reach? And I can actually start recording data and look at progress on that, right? But it would also serve as a prompt to the teacher to say, oh, I've got some kids that don't have their devices, right? So using any of those kind of augmented supports to make the day go easier are completely relevant and important. I mean, especially given the things that we have to do in a day's time. Especially if you're an educator, or you're running a clinic, you got 1,000 things going through your brain. So any sort of support, we want to make sure, yeah, pretend very much like a play check. Here's just some examples of different checklists that we've had. This is from Project Impact. If you're interested in reading stuff, a colleague of mine, Shawnee Wakeman, and I had a Project Impact. There's a bunch of adapted text and materials, and there's actually some modules on how to train others to implement reading instruction for kids with complex needs. I wanted to show you this. How am I doing? Oh, I've got 4 minutes. We were working with a recent school district, and we basically gave them a graph for just a simple Excel file, and we taught them how to, they wrote goals, 2 goals each, 2 objectives for each goal, and then each goal had 4 steps. And we had them plot using cumulative recording. So every 2 weeks we said, go in, and I want you to graph the number of goals that you've met, the number of objectives, and the number of steps. And kind of what you see there is obviously you're going to see they're not going to make huge progress, right? Because it goes from 1 to 2 for goals, but in those steps, you're going to see a significant progress. And so basically what happens is if we go back and check these and we see somebody's plateaued, they haven't made progress in a while, that signals we need to get in there. We need to do something else, right? I'm going to skip this, but again, talked about this a little bit earlier, some things in the environment that we can do to change our actual physical arrangement of the environment to support teacher behavior or clinician behavior. I want to show you this quickly. So I've moved over to Ocali, and we have put some of this place in practice. So we're kind of building a system where, and again, this kind of, I think, operationalizes like a potential model. So people go in, they do a self-assessment, right? It can be the ALCOD or whatever assessment that you use in your local area. We bring all those people taking that assessment together in kind of a professional learning group, right? So basically we bring them together, we orient them through the process, we kind of give them a yay, and then we pair them with somebody working on a similar goal. We ask them to record, to meet every 2 weeks, and to actually record on a digital file, their performance. Have I met my goal? Am I making progress? These are questions that I have. And then we do this every 2 weeks. And we come back to large group to bring everybody together and refocus on the momentum. Come back every 2 weeks until they meet those goals. And then we give them an opportunity to say, hey, do you want to take more goals? Would you like to do another one? And so the idea is to start building them into a professional development process, instead of like, oh, you're not doing great, let's come in and change your behavior. It's like, let's continue to grow throughout our profession. We actually have a version of this kind of out for a grant proposal right now, but we're also building this into Ocali, so we're kind of excited about that. That is it. So the big idea here is there's no bad intervention. It's just ineffective and harmful behaviors or practices, right? And the environment has taught them to do that. So people are just doing the best that they can. And if we're actually going to do better, we can't just give them a list. We have to actually start thinking about applying those mechanisms that we learned as good interventionists to their practice. So whether it's our own practice, right? Whether I want to go and say, I need to do better with this thing, or whether I'm working with somebody else. And then we want to get public. We want to get other people involved. It might take a small and committed army to help us get there. But again, doing it in a vacuum is very hard and for us to be able to move forward. All right, I have 2 seconds, but I can stay longer for any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. That was a lot.
All right, I'm trying to unmute.
Oh.
Where is it? Where's the unmute button? Thank you so much.
Oh, that's right.
What?
Oh, nothing. Do we have the final word? We have to give them the final word, right?
You do have to give them the final word. Do you remember what it is?
Tony. I do. It's Tony. As in Tony Iommi.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now. Stop. Okay.